Welcome back. In the last video, I provided you with the background information necessary to understand Isaiah chapter 7. So let's now reread Isaiah chapter 7 verses 1 and 2 just to refresh our memories. Quote, "In the days of Ahaz, son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram, and King Pekah, son of Remaliah of Israel, went up to attack Jerusalem, but could not mount an attack against it. When the house of David heard that Aram had allied itself with Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind." End quote. Thus, in this passage, we are told that King Pekah of Israel and King Rezin of Aram have formed an alliance in order to overthrow their Assyrian overlords, and are now waging war against King Ahaz of Judah in order to replace Ahaz with a puppet king who will join them in their revolt. And into this situation comes Isaiah, and he brings good news to King Ahaz. He tells Ahaz not to worry, for soon Aram and Israel will be destroyed and will no longer pose a threat to Judah. Isaiah gives 3 distinct prophecies to Ahaz, and each of these prophecies is associated with a child. The child of prophecy 1 is known as Shear-Jashub, meaning a remnant shall return. The child of prophecy 2 is known as Emmanuel, meaning God is with us. And finally, the child of prophecy 3 is known as Mahashala-Hashbaz, meaning swift to spoil, quick to plunder. Now, not only are each of these prophecies associated with a child, but also each prophecy is associated with a time frame. In each of these 3 prophecies, Isaiah gives a time in which God will judge Aram and Israel. In the first prophecy, we are told God will judge them in 65 years' time. In the second prophecy, we are told in 13 years' time. And in the third prophecy, we are told in 2 years' time. And that's a summary of Isaiah's 3 prophecies to King Ahaz. Each of them has a kid, and each of them has a time frame. Okay, I've just given you a lot of information, and it's alright if you don't fully understand it at the moment, but hopefully by the end of this series, all of this will make perfect sense. So let's begin to walk through each of these 3 prophecies. And let's begin with prophecy 1, which is associated with Shear-Jashub and also associated with the judgment which is coming in 65 years' time. We find this prophecy in Isaiah chapter 7, verses 3 to 9. In verse 3, we read, quote, "Then the Lord said to Isaiah, 'Go out to meet Ahaz, you and your son Shear-Jashub, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway of the fuller's field.'" End quote. So now you're probably asking yourself the question, why does Isaiah's son have such a strange name? Well, the name of his son encapsulates the good news Isaiah is about to give to Ahaz. Ahaz in this scene is terrified of Israel and Aram. As we know from 2 Chronicles, these 2 northern threats have taken some of the people of Judah into captivity. And now Ahaz is worried that they're going to attack Jerusalem itself. So in order to comfort Ahaz, Isaiah is told to bring his son Shear-Jashub to meet Ahaz. Now the name Shear-Jashub means a remnant shall return, and thus this is to remind Ahaz that one day those Judahites who were taken into captivity will return to Judah. We are also told that Isaiah met Ahaz at the end of the conduit of the upper pool, which is the water supply into Jerusalem. A possible reason why Ahaz was there is because at this time the water supply into Judah came through above ground aqueducts. And of course, having above ground aqueducts were not ideal when a city came under siege, for an enemy could easily demolish them. Thus Ahaz is concerned that Pekah and Rezin will destroy this water supply into the city when they lay attack upon Judah. And just an interesting fact which really isn't pertinent to our discussion here, but Ahaz's son Hezekiah resolves this problem by creating a below-ground tunnel to supply Jerusalem with water. This point is made by Mortier in his commentary, quote, "Ahaz was otherwise engaged at the aqueduct of the upper pool, trying to secure his water supply against the coming siege. For until the time of Hezekiah, water came to the city over ground and was therefore vulnerable." End quote. Let's continue reading at verse 4, quote, "And say to him, 'Take heed, be quiet, do not fear, and do not let your heart be faint, because of these 2 smouldering stumps of firebrands. because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and the son of Remaliah. Because Aram, with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah, has plotted evil against you, saying, "Let us go up against Judah, and cut off Jerusalem, and conquer it for ourselves, and make the son of Tabeel king in it." End quote. So here Ahaz is told not to fear the upcoming attack of Pekah and Rezin. In verse 6, we're also explicitly told that Pekah and Rezin were planning to replace Ahaz and make the son of Tabeel king in his place. We can safely assume that this son of Tabeel was strongly anti-Assyrian and therefore would join the two northern states in their rebellion against Assyria. Isaiah continues his prophecy in verse 7, which reads, quote, "Therefore thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, it shall not come to pass. For the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered, no longer a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you do not stand firm in faith, you shall not stand at all." End quote. The most important line within this prophecy is, within 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered, no longer a people. And this is the time frame associated with the prophecy I was speaking about beforehand. Here Isaiah is assuring Ahaz that as a result of Ephraim's attack upon Judah, God will judge Ephraim, and within 65 years they will cease to be a people. So now the question before us is, when exactly is Isaiah referring to? Well, we know Isaiah is speaking to Ahaz in about the year 735. So what happened 65 years after this prophecy? Mottier in his commentary writes the following, quote, "On the supposition that the 65 years is the periods of 735 to 670 BC, the reference is to the fact that in 671, Esarhaddon imported foreign settlers into the area of the northern kingdom. At that point, those deported after the fall of Samaria were bereft of a land to return to, and thus finally ceased as a sovereign people." End quote. So as Mottier notes, in 671, which is about 65 years after Isaiah's prophecy, King Esarhaddon of Assyria, who is 3 kings removed from Tiglath-Pileser III, imports foreigners into Israel. We read about this in 2 Kings chapter 17. In verse 24 we read, quote, "The king of Assyria bought people from Babylon, Cuthath, Ava, Hamath, and Seraphim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria, in the place of the people of Israel. They took possession of Samaria and settled in its cities." End quote. Thus King Esarhaddon brought these foreigners to Israel, and in so doing eliminated a pure Jewish presence in the land. And thus, in the words of Isaiah's prophecy, they are no longer a people. From this point forward, these people are known as Samaritans, which should be familiar to you from the New Testament. And as you know, true Jews hated Samaritans. And the reason for this hatred is because the Samaritans created a strange syncretistic religion of worshipping Yahweh alongside the pagan gods of these foreign imports. Therefore, the true Jews did not want to associate with the Samaritans. Proof of this can be found in Ezra chapter 4. In this passage, the true Jews have returned from Babylonian captivity and are rebuilding the temple. While they're building, some Samaritans ask if they too can join them and help construct the temple. Quote, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do. And we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of King Esarhaddon of Assyria brought us here." End quote. Of course, due to their pagan practices, Zerubbabel refuses to allow them to build the temple. In verse 3 we read, quote, "But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of the families in Israel said to them, 'You shall have no part with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus of Persia has commanded us.'" End quote. And that now concludes our discussion of the first prophecy of Isaiah. This prophecy is associated with Isaiah's son, Shear-Jashub, and predicts a future judgment of Israel in 65 years' time. Let's now turn to the second prophecy of Isaiah. Now this is where things get interesting, my friends. Prophecy 2 is the main event, because let's face it, the true reason why we're here is because we want to know who on earth is Emmanuel. Well, to learn more about that topic, you're going to have to join me in the next video. I hope to see you then.